Most people don't realize they're one decision away from either breakthrough or surrender. There's something that happens in the middle of a hardship where you face a specific moment of choice. I want to walk through what that moment actually is, and more importantly, what Paul understood about it that most of us miss. The promise is simple but not easy. By the end of this, you'll see why giving up isn't actually about failure. It's about forgetting something specific about who you are. And once you understand what Paul knew, that choice becomes clearer. Here is where this gets interesting. Paul's letters were written from jail cells, prison ships, and circumstances that would have justified anyone quitting. But the thing nobody usually asks is, what did Paul know that we don't know? What was his framework? When you read through his letters carefully, not just the highlights, but the passages people usually skip, there's a pattern underneath everything. It's not positive thinking. It's not willpower. It's something more structural than that. Let's slow down here because this is the part people miss. In his letter to the Corinthians, Paul lists what he endured. 5 times he received 40 lashes, 3 times beaten with rods, stoned once, shipwrecked 3 times. He spent nights adrift in the sea. He faced danger from rivers, robbers, his own people, false believers, hunger, cold, and exposure. And here's the key part. He says this while writing about joy. Not someday, not later, now. That's not survival. That's something else entirely. Most people read that and think Paul was just naturally tough, or that his faith was stronger. But that misses what he actually says. He tells us the exact mechanism, and this is where it changes everything. Paul knew something about God's presence that went beyond intellectual belief. He knew it, the way you know where your own hand is in the dark. It wasn't emotional, it was structural. He writes that God will never leave or forsake you, not when things get hard, not when they get really hard, not when they become incomprehensibly hard. But here's the twist. Knowing that truth and experiencing it are 2 different things. Paul wasn't just stating doctrine. He was describing the difference between knowing something is real and knowing you can access it in the moment you need it. Think about it this way. You might know that electricity exists. You might even understand the science. But if you're sitting in a dark room, that knowledge doesn't help you. You need to know where the switch is and reach for it. Paul's entire framework was about understanding you have access to something during hardship that doesn't depend on your circumstances changing. It depends on you actually reaching for it. This is the part that compresses everything. Paul had something to compare his situation against. He had a reference point. His reference wasn't whether his circumstances improved. His reference was whether he was in alignment with what God had asked him to do, and whether he believed God was working, even when he couldn't see it. Here's the clean way to think about it. Every person reaches a point in a hardship where they face the question, does quitting fit who I actually am? Paul asked himself that question constantly, and he kept arriving at the same answer. It doesn't fit, not because he was strong, but because quitting would have been a statement about what he believed was true about God and about himself. Most people don't realize giving up isn't actually a failure response. It's a belief response. When you quit, you're making a statement. You're saying either God isn't who you thought he was, or you're not who you thought you were, or both. Paul understood this structure so clearly that it became his anchor point. Now pay attention to this part. The strength Paul accessed wasn't something he generated. He writes about it explicitly. The same strength that raised Jesus from the dead is available to you, not metaphorically, actually available. But like the electricity switch, you have to know it's there and know how to access it. In his letters from prison, while facing execution, Paul talks about joy and peace. And people often spiritualize this away, like he was just thinking happy thoughts. But he's describing something different. He's describing what happens when you stop measuring your situation by your circumstances. Start measuring it by whether you're still aligned with what you believe is true. This is where the mechanism becomes visible. Paul spent his time reading scripture, meditating on what he knew to be true, and reminding himself of what God had done and promised. He wasn't denying his circumstances. He was choosing his reference point. He was choosing what he would measure everything against. Most people do the opposite without realizing it. They measure their faith by whether their circumstances improve. So when circumstances don't improve, their faith breaks. Paul measured his faith by whether he was still in alignment with what he believed was true. So when circumstances didn't improve, his faith deepened because he had to rely on something that didn't depend on circumstances. Here's where it gets real. That's the difference between people who persevere and people who quit at exactly the same point. It's not strength, it's what they're measuring against. Think about your own life for a moment. You've probably already quit on something. A relationship, a goal, a conviction. And at the moment you quit, it felt necessary. It felt like the only reasonable choice. But the moment you made it, something shifted internally. Can you remember what that felt like? Now imagine what would have shifted if you'd had a different reference point. If instead of measuring your situation by whether it was getting better, you measured it by whether you were still aligned with what you believed. That's not the same as staying in something harmful. Paul would have left genuinely dangerous situations. That's different. But it is the same as not confusing hardship with failure. Paul also knew something about purpose. He wasn't just enduring hardship abstractly. He knew why he was going through it. He was doing something that mattered to him because it mattered to God. That purpose was the second part of his framework. Most people think purpose is something you discover, and then everything clicks. But Paul's experience shows something different. Purpose is something you choose to believe about what you're doing right now. And when you choose that, hardship changes. Meaning, it's not just suffering, it's part of something. The suffering doesn't go away, but it stops being meaningless. This is the part nobody notices in his letters. Paul repeatedly comes back to the difference between what he calls the outer person and the inner person. His outer circumstances were getting worse, more imprisonment, more danger, more isolation. But he writes that his inner person was being renewed daily. That's not metaphorical language. That's him describing how to stay stable when everything external is destabilizing. And the way you renew the inner person, he explains, is by spending time with truth, scripture, the promises of God, the example of Jesus, the testimony of other believers. He's describing a practice, not a feeling. Here's where it shifts everything. Most people approach hardship reactively. Something bad happens. They feel bad. They think about quitting. And then they either do or they don't, based on how much they can endure. Paul approached it differently. He anticipated that hardship would come. He built his internal structure before the pressure hit. So when pressure came, he already had a framework in place. He already knew what he believed. He already had practiced reaching for strength that didn't depend on circumstances. He already had purpose that didn't depend on success. Daily scripture study plus alignment check plus purpose reminder equals sign internal stability across external chaos. That's the architecture. Most people think perseverance is about willpower, but Paul shows it's about building the right internal structure before you need it. This is the part that changes how you see your own situation. If you're in a hardship right now, you don't need more willpower. You need clarity on three things. What do you actually believe is true? Are you still aligned with that? And does what you're doing matter for a reason bigger than whether you succeed? Paul answers all three of those questions consistently in his letters. And that consistency was what allowed him to keep going when everything external suggested he should stop. Most people never ask themselves those questions until they're in crisis. And by then it's too late to build the framework. By then you're just trying to survive. Paul was suggesting something different. Build the framework now. Make the decisions now about what you believe and why. Connect yourself now to the strength that doesn't depend on circumstances. And when hardship comes, and it will come, you already know who you are and what you're doing. This is the final piece Paul understood, that joy and perseverance aren't the same thing. You can persevere without joy. You can grind through hardship on pure willpower, but that's exhausting, and it won't last. Joy is what happens when you're not measuring your situation by whether it's hard, but by whether you're still connected to what matters. The book of Philippians is remarkable for this reason. Paul writes it from prison, and he keeps talking about joy, not because his circumstances changed, but because he kept choosing what he was measuring against. Here's the simple truth: nobody tells you. When you're in hardship, you're not actually choosing whether to stay or quit. You're choosing what you're measuring your life against. If you measure it by pain, you'll quit. If you measure it by possibility of success, you might quit. But if you measure it by alignment with what you believe is true and what matters, then quitting becomes a different kind of choice. It becomes a real choice rather than a desperate escape. That's what Paul knew. And that's why he kept writing letters from a jail cell instead of sitting in silence, waiting for death. He still had something to say. He still had strength. He still had joy, not because anything external changed, but because he had built his life on something that didn't depend on external change. Most people quit right before the thing they need would have arrived. Paul understood this too, and he kept going because he wasn't measuring whether the thing had arrived. He was measuring whether he was still in alignment. And those are two different measurements with two different outcomes. Now here's what shifts when you understand this. You stop viewing hardship as a sign you're on the wrong path. You stop viewing difficulty as a signal to quit. You stop measuring your faith by your comfort, because you understand that alignment and purpose and internal strength are independent variables. From comfort and success and ease, belief in unseen strength plus daily alignment practice, plus purpose beyond outcomes, =sustainable perseverance.